The 90-day freeze on the tariff negotiations, I think, has had, and certainly I'm hearing this from businesses I'm working with in America, just frozen everything. And certainly I'm beginning to see that kind of happening in London and Europe. The short-term consequence of the tariff thing is yes, the shock, and now the freeze. And it's a bit like actually what Rachel Reeves did with the budget, where she was going, bad news is coming, it's coming. And she trailed that for literally weeks and months before the budget was actually announced. And actually just what happened was business froze. It stopped making decisions, it stopped hiring, it stopped signing contracts. And actually that's so corrosive.
I wonder if this could be a perverse benefit for Britain actually. Are we now looking like more of the safe haven? We've got the rule of law, we've got, strong regulations, rule of law. And I think we are seeing Britain perhaps slightly benefiting from the chaos of Trump. We have John Caldwell's an entrepreneur in City AM this week arguing that America's already experienced a brain drain.
The strength of America has been in its people, obviously, but a lot of other things as well. Silicon Valley sort of explosion was a mix of entrepreneurialism, government investment, and immigration. So it's not just about people, the secret of America's genius, but certainly a brain drain, particularly in STEM tech, to Europe, not just the UK, potentially Canada as well, will have a kind of negative impact on America for sure, and potentially benefit the UK. I think we need to have an honest conversation about fertility rates and demographics. Fertility rates have been declining since the late 60s. This is not a millennial or Gen Z issue. And it has serious economic consequences. And the economic consequences is not just that people are having fewer babies, is that people are living longer, and there's a disproportionate ratio of older people that by and large are expensive. And young people, by and large, pay into the coffers. It's the dynamic of that and the economic consequences of that. There's a brilliant author called Dr. Paul Morland who writes exceptionally well about the economic consequences of a low birth rate society. And it's sluggish growth, it's higher dependencies on immigration, it quite often means fewer wars. But you end up in a society like Japan where, it's been sort of suggested that diapers for old people outsell diapers for babies. So there is a really important economic conversation we need to have about a society that is living in an era of low birth rate.
Welcome to Free Thinking, bringing you informed opinion and insightful analysis from the comment pages of City AM, with me, Alys Denby, Opinion and Features Editor of City AM. And today, I'm delighted to be joined by the brilliant Eliza Filby, historian, generations expert, best-selling author of Inheritocracy, and most importantly, of course, a City AM columnist. Eliza, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Pleasure.
Delightful. The city is bathed in sunshine as we celebrate 100 glorious days of Donald Trump. And according to him, it's been the greatest start to any administration ever. But I think the markets are telling a slightly different story. Today's
He's not
City...
a bashful man, no.
No, he's not modest. So we've got today's City AM front page. Apparently, the American economy has actually experienced a 0.3% fall in growth in the first 3 months of 2025. So what do you make of Trump's first 100 days? How would you say it was going?
I think it's been an absolute onslaught of everything, all the things all at once. And I think it's been, it's hard to kind of take stock, but whether we're talking about the Signal chat, whether we're talking about the Zelensky interview, whether we're talking about the tariffs, bingo, there's been so much. It really has been like the first series of a reality TV show. And he does, he's unashamedly a politician that plays that game. I mean, I think this is a really trite thing to say, but it's almost like too soon to tell as to what the consequences are. The 90-day freeze on the tariff negotiations, I think, has had, and certainly I'm hearing this from businesses I'm working with in America, just frozen everything.
Right. And
certainly I'm beginning to see that kind of happening in London and Europe. So I think the short-term consequence of the tariff thing is yes, the shock, and now the freeze. And it's a bit like actually what Rachel Reeves did with the budget, where she was going, the bad news is coming, it's coming. And she trailed that for literally weeks and months before the budget was actually announced. And actually just what happened was business froze. It stopped making decisions, it stopped hiring, it stopped signing contracts. And that's so corrosive. And those figures on the US economy, therefore, are not surprising and potentially will get much worse. So, that sort of old adage that business likes uncertainty. Well, we're in for a rocky ride of consistent, persistent uncertainty. So it's trying to find sort of the levers you can pull and the decisions you can make in that kind of climate, and just kind of basically embrace it and get used to it.
I wonder if this could be a perverse benefit for Britain, actually. Are we now looking like more of the safe haven? We've got the rule of law, we've got, strong regulations, rule of law. And I think we are seeing Britain perhaps slightly benefiting from the chaos of Trump. We have John Caldwell's an entrepreneur in City AM this week arguing that America's already experienced a brain drain.
Yeah, which I think that's really fascinating. I mean, I think, the strength of America has been in its people, obviously, but a lot of other things as well. Silicon Valley sort of explosion was a mix of entrepreneurialism, government investment, and immigration. So it's not just about people, the secret of America's genius, but certainly a brain drain, particularly in STEM tech, to Europe, not just the UK, potentially Canada as well. Will have a kind of negative impact on America for sure, and potentially benefit the UK. I mean, we're seeing lots of people emigrate from the UK, particularly high net worth individuals, and particularly young, bright minds, bright young things who are looking for, a lower tax burden, more accessible housing, and, greater bang for their buck and more, frankly, better weather. So lots of them are going to Dubai. There is a potential that Europe and UK benefits, particularly in the tech sector. Will we see, because of this brain drain, actually, the next Google in Dublin, Paris or London? Who knows? But I think, speaking to people in the US, the sense I'm getting, particularly young people in the US, I have a lot of family in America, there's a sense of uncertainty, hostility, and an idea of, we're not sure this is a place we can, to build a family, build a home, those kinds of things. So where do we look to do that? And I think, the UK obviously has not just the rule of law, but particularly London. When people think of the UK abroad, they, basically think of London, let's be honest, has that infrastructure and that ecosystem, and particularly the educational scene as well is really, really important.
But I think it's particularly important, therefore, that the government stops making bad decisions on tax, on attacking our education sector, the independent sector, and making sure that this country is as appealing as possible to international talent, because we do have an opportunity here as a result of Trump. But I think environment is
I sort of struggle with this idea of whether we're poaching nurses from Indonesia or techies from California. We should also be investing in the infrastructure and the skills building within the UK to ensure that young people in this country feel equipped to build the futures that they want to build for themselves. And we don't, and we haven't historically. We've pumped a lot of money and sent a lot of people to university, and those rewards haven't always come. And we did very little for those that didn't go to university. So, business historically and now is crying out for skilled individuals, and those skills are evolving at pace because of AI. And I just think cherry picking talented people from abroad isn't always the solution.
And of course, we do need to increase our own domestic population. We've got a terrible fertility crisis in this country, as America does as well. And you wrote a brilliant piece in City AM this week about Trump's plan to solve America's fertility crisis by giving people, I think, sort of $5,000 for having a baby.
Splashing the cash.
I mean, I remember actually a similar proposal being floated here in Britain, but it was in terms of a tax break. And I think, well, when me and my husband were trying for a baby, we really weren't thinking of the tax man.
Yeah, exactly. Come on, darling. Let's do it. Yeah,
the man from HMRC is watching. Maybe an upfront cash bonus is slightly more appealing, but I think, as you argued in your piece, it's not going to work.
I think we need to have an honest conversation about fertility rates and demographics, because it has become, fertility rates have been declining since the late 60s. This is not a millennial or Gen Z issue. This has been historically, declining in Europe particularly, and quite dramatically actually also in America in the last 20 years. And it has serious economic consequences. And the economic consequences is not just that people are having fewer babies, is that people are living longer, and there's a disproportionate ratio of older people that by and large are expensive, and younger people by and large pay into the coffers and pay for the older people in the population. So it's the dynamic of that and the economic consequences of that. There's a brilliant author called Dr. Paul Morland who writes exceptionally well about the economic consequences of a low birth rate society. And it's sluggish growth, it's higher dependencies on immigration, it quite often means fewer wars. But, you end up in a society like Japan where, it's been sort of suggested that diapers for old people outsell diapers for babies. And so there is a really important economic conversation we need to have about a society that is living in an era of low birth rates. However, number one, those countries around the world that have tried this Trump approach of incentivizing with cash, and actually the Trump incentive of $5,000 is actually quite low compared to even Russia, where they offer $7,000 per child, and in Hungary, where they offer married couples a 30 grand loan, and that loan is wiped out if they have 3 children. So actually, it's actually quite paltry compared to the other initiatives, but also the other initiatives haven't worked. Taiwan is a brilliant example. It spent £3 billion, not just in cash incentives, but state structural reforms to offer better maternity leave, better parental leave, better nursery care for women and families to grow and have children. And they haven't really pushed the dial, moved the needle on the birth rates in that country. So it's not just cash incentives don't work, but also frankly, changing the state's services for families doesn't work either. So what does?
This is the question.
And I think we need to have a recognition that essentially choosing to have a child is a personal choice. And it's a personal choice in the 2020s in a very different way that it was a personal choice in the 1960s when there was greater access to contraception. And the fundamental change has been the position of women and the access and availability of opportunities, particularly in careers, for women. And I think the conversation around pronatalism worries me hugely because it's becoming quite toxic and politicized, when actually the real conversation you should be having is how can you not tell women to have more babies and get back into re-embracing the role of motherhood and their traditional duties, is actually how can you create the conditions in which those that have children have more, because they're the ones you're going to convince. Yeah. They're the ones that potentially certain levers that you pull in the economy and in state services could make a difference. I mean, I have 2 children. If it was cheaper, if it was easier, for example, I run my own business, if there was some kind of tax incentives that I can offset the childcare that I have to pay for in order to do my work, I may have had a 3rd child.
I do find it really interesting, as you say, that this is a phenomenon across the developed world in countries with very different political environments, which does suggest, as you say, that this isn't a policy problem, it's a women's choices problem. And I feel exactly the same as you. I mean, I've got 1 child and very happy. I find it easy to balance my career ambitions with my childcare. Right. Yeah. And I feel like that's a perfectly legitimate choice. And as you say, I find it quite worrying when people tell me you should be having 2 or 3 because that's the replacement rate. That's
going to incentivize you.
Again, that's as bad as the man.
Get on that replacement rate.
Exactly.
Exactly, yeah.
And so, I do think that you're right that it's encouraging women who've already made that choice, who've already found a stable relationship,
Or not. I have plenty of friends that are single mothers by choice as
absolutely.
Well. And not by choice, actually, as well. So I think I do worry the pronatalism debate will go down a rather toxic route if it hasn't already. I do then worry that we're not actually looking at and being really honest about what a low birth rate economy looks like. No politician really talks about that. And I also think, like as we said, help those that already have children have more, because that's where the real potential is as well.
That said, I do think there are some specific policies that we have here in the UK that are inimical to families. For example, we have the 2-child benefit cap. That seems crazy when we don't have enough children.
Yes, and it's also quite
judgmental?
Well, it's assuming that there's a certain section of society that you don't want to breed too much.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I think that's
Gen
an appalling
X element to that.
An appalling policy. I think we also have a welfare system that shovels benefits towards pensioners at the expense of working families. I don't think that's sustainable.
Yes.
And we know about the ongoing social care costs of an ageing population. So that's a completely unsustainable system that no politician is upfront and honest about. And also the housing crisis. Of course, you can't be making babies if you don't have bedrooms to do it in and bedrooms for them to sleep in.
Yes, I mean, I don't always buy the economic argument that better housing will mean more babies, because I mean, look, women had a lot more babies in a lot worse economic conditions. I think it's about actually the story of progress that we've seen in the last 30 years is that women have more choice. We've given them other things that they can do now.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Exactly. I think it's a positive as well as one with negative consequences for the future.
Exactly.
I think what was really interesting was that you said that this has been happening since the 60s, but I do feel like the reasons why people are choosing to have fewer have maybe changed generation by generation. I feel like we're millennials, and I feel like we're a generation that was told you can have it all. You should pursue a career, and you can have babies and you can balance it all. And I feel like the kind of women who came maybe just before us were sort of, I don't know how she does it, talking about how hard it was.
Yeah.
I think now Generation Z actually want to hear or need to hear more of the positives, like how happy and fulfilling family life can be, because I feel like they're quite put off by us moaning about it all the time.
I think it's important not to look through this debate through a sort of predominantly middle-class educated lens. I do think one of the striking things is that the real decline in birth rates amongst working class women, not middle class women. However, the narrative is always this is the fertility crisis being pursued by women who have dropped babies for books and careers. I think you're right. I think the millennial narrative was kind of let's sort of learn from the sort of Sex and City Gen X women who sort of tried to have it all but couldn't have it all, and quite often was trying to contort their fertility around a career structure that was built for men. We grew up feeling that we could do everything and were told, don't have babies too early.
Yes.
The amount of lectures I got in school around the dangers of teenage pregnancy. Nothing, by the way, on my fertility clock and how important that was to kind of think about. I do think Gen Z are much more aware of their fertility, perhaps too much, I would say. The level of paranoia around fertility, egg freezing, all of that. I do think that there's sort of too much, almost kind of too much knowledge out there on that, and creating a level of paranoia. I do think they're perhaps looking at their Gen X mothers going, actually, particularly professional Gen X mothers going, maybe I wanted you home more. Maybe, that professional path in a digital age meant that, perhaps when I do it, I want to do it slightly differently, having looked at how my mother did it. I did a focus group of Gen Z women, and one of the striking things that they were saying to me was, I never saw my mother, or when she was on holiday, she was really stressed, or she was really successful and really paved the way in her career, but actually, I wish she'd been home more. And I get a sense that Gen Z women are much more sort of realistic about the dangers of focusing too much on your career and sacrifice to your family. Because it is a juggle. Let's not pretend that, where am I going today? I'm having to do this, jump on the tube, go to Green Park, have a lunch, have another meeting with a colleague, and then I have to leapfrog it to South East London for a swimming gala. And it's like... Oh my God. In the middle of the day. Yeah. In the middle of the day where it's just assumed that the mother can do that. And it is often the mother. So I just think there is a level of new level of realism amongst Gen Z, because they grew up with invariably mothers that were in that kind of professional digitalized world that, that they want to perhaps do it slightly differently when they do it.
I think that's really interesting to hear. And I think that the day you're describing, this is a world still set up for a family in which basically mothers don't work or are always available. Like even just the school day finishing at 3:30. What is that?
I know, and the cost of wraparound care.
Yeah.
Wrapped
Like a little gift.
Yeah.
I think another way this generational divide is playing out is in the increasing fragmentation of our politics. So we're recording this on Thursday. People are going to the polls in local elections today. So we don't know what's happening, but everybody...
Are they? I mean, how many people will vote in this?
How many people will actually vote?
I mean, the turnout, I suspect, will be
quite low. Yes. But people will be looking at the result of the Runcorn by-election in particular and these new mayoralties.
I'll be staying up for that one.
Oh, God, no. No, I'm a mum. I need to be up at 7 in the morning.
I'm joking. You went for Runcorn. Yeah.
And everybody is expected to see great gains for reform. And what we definitely have seen is this rise in young men going reform, young women going green. What do you make of this? What do you think is the appeal of reform?
Well, I think just to kind of take it a step back, historically women have always voted Conservative.
Yeah.
You know, and actually that quite often surprises young people because they're like, what? Yes.
And historically it's because women value kind of stability, family values.
Well, I think that was sort of, the cultural conservatives rather than the economic conservatism definitely appealed. And, Thatcher famously leaned into that by holding up, on the election trail, the two shopping bags and saying, this is what you can buy under Labour and this is what you can buy under the Conservatives, showing the impact of inflation on the household shopping bill. So Thatcher was brilliant at it, leaning into tying economic conservatism and cultural conservatism and uniquely appealing it to women. However, one of the things that you're seeing and have seen in millennials and now Gen Z is actually, historically, we start, progressive and liberal, and we gradually, as we get older and, more downtrodden and more realistic, become conservatives. Or sensible. And it hasn't happened for millennial women. So millennial women have stayed voting Labour. And so Gen Z actually not the anomaly, it's actually millennial women because they haven't moved to the right. But you're right in that the other thing that's happened is amongst Gen Z women and men, you're seeing a gradual, I think it's somewhat overplayed actually, the gradual sort of growing gap between women voting left, progressive, green in particular, and young men voting reform. And I think to tease that out, what is it that's the particular appeal for young men when it comes to reform? I think reform are amazing on social media.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we have to acknowledge the ways in which they've tapped into fears around the economy, fears around jobs, fears around immigration, and the particular impact it has on young people as opposed to old people. The way that you stoke those fears around immigration for the young is very different for how you play it for the old. It's more economic than cultural, for example.
Yeah.
I think even the way that actually reform, are tapping into support for the NHS. Support for the NHS amongst the young is pretty high. And I think that the reform messaging, obviously around some kind of restoring of national confidence is really important for young people. And I do a lot of focus groups with Gen Zers. And actually last week I featured a fascinating interview with a Gen Zer in my Substack. And one of the things that he was saying to me was like, I said, would you fight for your country? And he said, Britain's given me nothing to live for, so it's certainly given me nothing to die for. And the level of skepticism, it's not even skepticism, it's disillusionment, it's lack of faith in not just the state to transform the fortunes of young people, but also pride in the UK and desire, obviously, to seek riches, opportunity, frankly, even stability, and certainly low tax elsewhere. And I think that's the particular appeal of reform. I think there is also a danger of overplaying the gender divide within Gen Z, because I think there is an overriding narrative that education hasn't brought them what it thought it would, and the impact of student loans and student debt, for those that go to university, obviously, is huge on Gen Z. the over-reliance and need for the safety net and support structures of the bank of mum and dad. Obviously, I've written a lot about that. And
Inheritocracy.
And the hotel of mum and dad. It's not just the bank of mum and dad, it's the hotel of mum and dad. The IFS brought a report out in January, and it was fascinating to see actually the impact of the hotel of mum and dad on working class communities, much more debilitating, whereas for middle class families it was very much like a lift up. You lived at the hotel bank and the bank of mum and dad for a number of years, and then you could leapfrog. So I think there's that. I think that the disillusionment around work, and particularly the stagnation in wages, I know they've risen recently, but essentially work isn't paying, work isn't buying you what our parents, and obviously housing as well. There is no sort of, where's the access point into adulthood? Yeah. Into independence, into building a life, let alone building a family. And that is, I think, being felt as much by Gen Z women as Gen Z men. I think Gen Z women perhaps have a greater sense of individual empowerment, and particularly those that are, succeeding in the education system, because education does still provide you with a leg up. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I suppose the bigger point is I'm not sure these local elections will be, because they're often about bins rather than great economic debates, right? So I don't know if you'll be able to sort of tease out some great insights from these elections. And I think you may see, and we talked a bit about this before we started shooting, was how disillusioned are people with Labour yet? Yes. Because I think actually, paradoxically, the Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have done a very good job at going, it's all really bad and we don't quite know what to do, and we're not sure what levers we can pull when, things have changed, and it's a great, some say it's talking down Britain and it's not great for economic confidence. But on the other hand, it's also really good at sort of like setting realistic expectations politically. And it's not just saying, we inherited a mess from the Conservatives. It's actually like, there's war in Europe, there's tariffs in the US, it's actually really, it's given, I think, the Labour Party a bit of leverage, because they've not come in and promised the world. And they didn't at all. And now they're now coming in and going, well, the world's actually changed, so I'm glad we didn't promise it.
So low expectations.
Yes. And when I talk to young people, and I say young people because I'm not young anymore, and it's important to make that distinction, you're seeing that the disillusion isn't necessarily, viciously against Labour. It's still with Conservatives. I mean, the Conservatives have got a real problem. And it's still not sort of like, let's just embrace reform, because they're definitely offering this kind of vision of the future.
It's interesting too.
So we're in a real transition point, as we should be, between elections.
And I wonder if to loop us right back round to the beginning, if reform might at some point be punished for their perceived closeness to Trump. That's a dynamic we've certainly seen it play out in Canada.
Yeah. If you look at the data, actually, it's interesting that people have ceased to see America as this kind of beacon of...
Well, as they should.
No, but it's not just Trump. It kind of predates that. It also involves, the race riots and there's
George Floyd.
Yeah, but it's also about the decline of Hollywood and the sort of globalization of culture through TikTok. And so I think I grew up thinking, I just want to get to New York, or I want to get to LA. There was a kind of aspirational, dreamy sense of what America represented. I don't think young people have that anymore. I did look at some data this morning that was saying would your anti-Americanism stop you from buying American-made products? In France, it does.
That's so French. I love it.
That's so French. In the UK, they were way down.
Okay.
In Canada, yes.
Yeah.
It does. There's a real anti-American hostility there. But I think the sort of idealism and the fascination with America is gone.
And I think maybe there's a yearning, and this is why reform is succeeding, for British identity to mean something again.
Yeah, but I mean, I sort of feel like historically we always have that conversation. It's also, they're having that conversation, when...
Yeah, the kind of post-imperial Britain in decline conversation has been going on for hundreds of years.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, whether it was Cool Britannia or whether it was, when we created Britain, you know, with Scotland. I feel like that perennial debate is quite tiresome. I do think, you know, a sort of understanding of our place in the world post-Brexit is still a bit murky.
Definitely.
And that's understandable because not just we have changed, but the world has changed, particularly in the last 6 months. So we're still sort of, you know, stepping into the dark. We don't actually know what that means. Are we aligning ourselves with Europe? Are we aligning ourselves with America? Are we trying to sort of, you know, play everyone off against each other? Are we, you know, sort of aligning ourselves with Chinese investment or, you know, Middle Eastern? Where are we getting this magic infrastructure from? We don't know. I think it's sort of, crudely speaking, all to play for.
I think that is a note to end on. We don't know. It's all very uncertain. Join us again.
Thanks so much. Thank you.